The Ghost in the Mirror by John Bellairs, Chapter 9. On March 17th, the moon was new. By that time, Mrs. Zimmerman had recovered enough to help around the house. The Weiss family was delighted to learn what Roswitha had known all along. Mrs. Zimmerman was a terrific cook. She taught Mrs. Weiss a delicious strudel recipe, and she did wonders with roast pork, chicken pie, and best of all, spice cake. The whole Weiss family praised her dishes to the skies, and Mrs. Weiss was grateful to be able to do more talking and less cooking than normal. Mrs. Zimmerman proved to be a good listener, too, never running out of patience before Mrs. Weiss's torrent of words. And she had enough lingering magic to follow Grandpa Drexel's weekly whispered directions in preparing herbal remedies for him. He did not improve much, but at least the old man held his own. On Monday night, March 17th, Roswitha had a moment to talk with Grandpa Drexel, who felt just well enough to sit in his rocking chair before the kitchen fire. She admitted miserably that her big idea of discovering the motive behind the gossip about the Weiss family had not worked out, and she asked the old man if he felt able to go ahead with the preparations of Mrs. Zimmerman's magical charm. "It has to be a secret," Roswitha said, "so please don't tell her that I asked." The old man sat with a blanket around his bony shoulders. His face was thinner than ever, and his hands shook all the time. He whispered, "It means a great deal to you to have your friend's magic restored." Roswitha nodded. Then she took a deep breath and added, "But I don't want you to try anything that would hurt you. So if you're too weak to make the crystal, then... Roswitha tried hard to swallow. "Then I guess you better not try." The old man gave a weary smile. "We shall see," he muttered. "On Thursday night, the moon shall be just right, a crystal prepared. In its light will grow in power as the crescent moon grows in size. So if we have a clear night, I will try. If the night is cloudy, well, we shall try again next month." Roswitha nodded miserably. If they failed this time, she knew it would signal the failure of their mission to keep the Weisses from being driven from their farm, and so Grandpa Weiss would never have a second chance. Tuesday was blustery, with sleet and freezing rain, and Roswitha's heart sank. Wednesday was a day of low, ragged gray clouds rushing overhead, and she was miserable. But then at about noon on Thursday, the sun peeked out through a few jagged breaks in the clouds. The clouds began to blow away, and by late afternoon the sky was clear and blue. She began to hope that everything might turn out all right after all. That evening, Grandpa Drexel asked Roswitha to help him upstairs. She did, and at his direction, she went to the room where he had showed her the crystal and got it for him. He stood at the big window at the west end of the hall, lingering in the purple sky. To the west was a skinny crescent moon, its horns pointed up. "I will work the charm here," he said. "You must help me prepare." He gave her a flat piece of chalk and told her to draw a circle on the wooden floor. Roswitha followed his directions, and he showed her a paper with a design on it, like one of the hex symbols she had seen. This one had 3 circles inside a big circle, and each small circle had a strange word written on it. Roswitha faithfully copied the design. "Good," Grandpa Drexel said. Now you must leave me here for a quarter of an hour. Come back then and we will see what we will see." That was a long 15 minutes. Roswitha went downstairs and helped Mrs. Weiss, who bustled about cleaning the kitchen. "Roswitha, you are nervous as a cat tonight," she said. "Oh, you would think a young man was coming to court you, and you are not ready, and you not ready yet. Sweep the crumbs from the counter, please. Oh, the trouble we are having today. Mrs. Pilcher refused to sell me eggs and told me the farmers are talking about running us out of our house. Imagine. Oh, good fortune comes in teaspoons and bad luck comes in gallons, as my mother always said. No, dear, the spoon's in this drawer, please. I was saying to Herman only yesterday." Somehow or other, Roswitha got through the quarter hour without screaming. Then she hurried upstairs. Grandpa Drexel leaned against the windowsill. He nodded feebly to her as she helped him to his room. In the yellow light of an oil lantern, she saw a stack of books on a desk there. Once again, they reminded Roswitha of the ones she had seen at Mr. Stoltzfutz's house. And once again, as the thought came to Roswitha, she felt sleepy and confused and unable to speak. But Grandpa Drexel noticed that she was staring at the books. "I have been reading a little about Erzbergers," he said, as he tapped the top book. "Albertus Magnus, this one. I've marked a passage about mirrors. If I had more strength..." He reeled, and Roswitha helped him to the bed. He sat on the edge of the mattress and handed Roswitha the little crystal sphere. "There," he said, "the spell has started, and it has made me tired. I must rest now. Remember, to gain full power, It must be buried in the earth for 7 years, longer to give it more power. Bury it tomorrow night when the moon is in the sky again. I must rest. Rosrita realized that the effort of enchanting the crystal had been almost too much for the old man. She ran into the hallway and got down on her knees to erase the chalk circles. When she stood up, she held the crystal in her palms and stared at it. At its heart, a tiny crescent shape glowed, just like the moon. It was a pale purple, Mrs. Zimmerman's favorite color. Slipping away from the Weiss farm was difficult, but it could be managed, as Rosrita discovered the next evening. She had thought hard about the problem of burying the crystal, and at last she had come up with an idea that might work. She bundled up warmly, took a lantern when no one was looking, and hurried away from the farm. It was a long, cold walk. However, she was glad to find that her ankle seemed completely well again. At last she arrived at her destination, long past sunset. The moon was still in the sky, though it was low on the horizon and was beginning to turn red. It was still a crescent, but a little fatter than it had been the night before. Rosrita looked all around until she found a good place. She had smuggled a large spoon out of the Weiss kitchen. She used it to dig away the thin crust of melting snow and to scoop up the earth. The weather was cold but not freezing, and the soggy ground was soft. The crystal went into a special resting place. On the top of it went the soil that Rosrita had dug up. She packed dirt around the enchanted globe until it was well buried, and then she studied the landscape carefully, memorizing landmarks. Using the spoon, she made some marks that she thought would help her later. She ruined the spoon, but she told herself that this was the price that had to be paid if her plan was to work. She hurried back to the Weiss farm under a starry sky, the lantern throwing a yellow circle of light around her. For the first time, she realized exactly how dark a country night could be, especially when there were no neon motel signs or stoplights or street lamps to light the way. The stars helped a little, but their light was cold and feeble. The wind rushed in the trees, and now and then a distant dog howled, making her walk a little faster. At last, she saw the warm yellow windows of the Weiss house far ahead, and she walked faster than ever. Rosrita was abreast of the great dark shape that was Cottage Rock when she saw something strange. A pale bluish light glowed at the foot of the rock, not a bright light like a flashlight or even a candle, but a soft radiance. She was a little afraid, but she was more curious and frightened, so she left the road and crunched over the old snow until she reached Cottage Rock. On the snow at her feet lay an open book. Rosrita stooped and picked it up, wondering why on earth it was here. The Weisses had only a few books, aside from the ones in Grandpa Drexel's room, and they took good care of them. Books were scarce and expensive for a farm family. The volume was large and flat, and it was so awkward to hold that Rosrita could not manage to lift her lantern high enough to get a good look at it, but her eye fell on the first few words of the left-hand passage. Incantus Bravurt Diabolicus Maleficum Zersteren Mickle Gehent. Rosrita frowned. She knew a little French. Jonathan had taught her a little Latin, but this was not in either of them, although some of the words were Latin. And it did not look like the German words she had seen in the fracture writing framed and hung like mottos on the wall of the Weiss house. In fact, it did not look like any real language. Rosrita wondered how she was even able to read it in the darkness, but then she realized the letters themselves were luminous. They were some of the source of the book's faint glow. She read a few more words and found them puzzling and nonsensical. She really ought to take the book to Grandpa Drexel to see what he could make of it, but maybe if she read a little more, she would understand. Sometimes the odd words almost seemed to make some kind of sense. Rosrita read the whole page. When she had finished the last two words, Principium Istum, she felt a change in the air around her. Rosrita tried to tear her gaze away from the page. She could not. She was trapped. She remembered Grandpa Drexel's warning about magical books, but now it was too late. She had started reading this one, and she could not stop. The night around her grew thicker, darker. She dropped the lantern, and its light went out. The black shape of Cottage Rock reared before her. Rosrita felt that something malevolent waited there now, up atop the rock, 10 feet above her head. She had not visualized it, but she knew that some demonic thing was beginning to take shape, forming out of thin air. She felt its anger and its hatred. The words she was reading were bringing this soft being, or bringing this awful being into the world, and it could not wait to tear her limb from limb. Roswitha could not stop reading. She began the top of the next page. With every effort she could muster, she tried to rip her gaze away from the page. She could succeed only in slowing down her pace. By the time she was halfway down the page, she heard a deep, snuffling grunt from above her. Then a horrible, hissing laugh, mocking and eager. Hot breath blew against the back of her neck. It smelled of decay and brimstone, like rotten eggs. Her hair prickled. She could almost feel a taloned hand reaching down from above her, hovering in the darkness just over her head, ready to snatch her up the moment she finished reading the spell. She wanted to scream, to run, to throw the book away. Held by the deadly enchantment, she could do none of these things. Her mind raced furiously. Grandpa Drexel had said something about how you escaped from this kind of spell. What was it? A smart person could get out of the trap if he took every step backwards. That was it. But what did that mean? She had not been walking as she read, but standing still. Roswitha heard a slithery, wet sound. Something big was licking its terrible lips. Liquid dropped hissing onto the snow. The thing forming on the rock was drooling, and its spittle was hot enough to boil. She was almost at the end of the third page. From the corner of her eye, she saw that the print ended at the very top of the next page. Another sickening burst of hot stench rolled over her. Then Roswitha had an idea. She began to read backward. Word by word, she found she could easily work her way back up the page. It got easier as she went along. She had a sense of great hostility and frustration from the creature on the rock, but this grew less and less. She read backwards up the second page, and then the first. At last she came to the first words she had noticed, but now she went through them in reverse. Gehent, Mikkel, Zersteron, Maleficum, Diabolicus, Bravort, Incantus. The book writhed like a snake in her hands. She flung it away, and it burst into flame. Roswitha jumped back. Before the book even touched the ground, a hot white flame had consumed it. She was free. With a shaking hand, she reached down and picked up the lantern she had dropped. She had no way of relighting it, and she was in darkness, but she knew somehow that Cottage Rock was just a rock again, and that no malevolent demon crouched upon it, waiting to devour her. Despite her great fear, Roswitha sternly forced herself to wait until she had control of herself again. Then she walked in a determined way straight for the Weiss house. Roswitha had the feeling that this episode was not like the books in Stolzwitz's house. No spell would prevent her from talking about her experience, but she also knew that she did not want to talk about it, not yet. She had stupidly done the very thing Grandpa Drexel had warned her against. She was angry at herself and angry at the person who had left the book, for she knew that someone had deliberately tried to kill her or one of the Weisses by leaving the book at the foot of Cottage Rock, where Heinrich and the other children often played. Now Roswitha was more determined than ever to get to the bottom of this nefarious evil, and she would help the Weisses and Grandpa Drexel and Mrs. Zimmerman too. Though she was breathing hard, she got back to the farm safely, and when Mrs. Weiss scolded her for frightening them all, she apologized and said that she had to go for a long walk to clear her mind. Hilda looked at her uncertainly, and Heinrich scowled. Somehow, talking with Roswitha and plotting things with her had made him feel braver than he used to be. He clearly resented missing whatever adventure she had embarked on, but worst of all, Mrs. Zimmerman gave Roswitha a long, sad look. It almost broke her heart. But Roswitha could not tell her friend what she had been up to. She went to bed that night, confused and upset. As for Mrs. Zimmerman, she felt almost well again. It troubled her that she still could not remember very much about how they had arrived in this strange place and time, or even a great deal about the mirror. Still, while Mr. Drexel nursed her back to health, and then later, when she took her turn and ministered to him, she had learned a thing or two. If Roswitha had secrets that she wasn't telling, Mrs. Zimmerman had a few too. In fact, the reason that Grandpa Drexel had been studying the magical prescriptions of Albertus Magnus was that he and Mrs. Zimmerman were researching magic mirrors. These were dangerous, as Mrs. Zimmerman had inadvertently discovered. According to what Mr. Drexel learned, an enchanted mirror could literally be a way of inviting spirits, either good or evil ones, to our world. One evening, as he finished his supper, Grandpa Drexel asked Mrs. Zimmerman where she had found this mirror, and whether she knew much about its magic. No, she had replied slowly. I didn't even know that the mirror was magic, for was a magic one for the longest time. As I recall, I found it in a junk store about 20 years ago. I like to pick through junk stores and collect odd items, and this mirror just seemed to cry out to me. It was odd, it was old, scratched, and dim, but I bought it for 50 cents and took it home and cleaned it up. It was hung in my house for ages, and until about 2 or 3 months ago, I never had any trouble with it. Grandpa Drexel was sitting propped up on it in his bed, and Mrs. Zimmerman sat in a chair beside him. She had been reading aloud to him from his magic texts, and the old man listened with closed eyes. "And then," he said, "you say the magic began with flashing lights and you saw a ghost?" "Yes," Mrs. Zimmerman told him. "It was the ghost of the woman who first saw that I had some magic and showed me how to awaken it." Grandpa Drexel opened his eyes after that. He murmured, "Strange. I always was taught that a woman's magic had to be started by a male wizard or vice versa, but I have lived long enough to know that the ways of magic are devious. So, how much can you remember of the evil force?" Mrs. Zimmerman shook her head. "Almost nothing. Just two hideous, staring eyes, burning red, like coals of fire. Oh!" She shivered. "And I heard a sort of voice in my head saying, 'Forget, forget.'" Grandpa Drexel doodled. He reached for one of the books and leafed slowly through it. He found the page he was seeking and touched an illustration there. It was a sort of combination of letters, like this. Grandpa Drexel tapped the strange figure twice. "This was one of the things scratched in the back of your mirror. Do you know what it is?" Mrs. Zimmerman shook her head. "I can see that it is a magic emblem of some sort, but I don't recognize it. My special field is talismans, not Kabbalistic insignia." Grandpa Drexel shook his head dolefully. "This mark is the symbol for the Enoch chain demon, Azael. He is an evil spirit who prevents and corrupts innocent earth magic." Mrs. Zimmerman went pale. "I have heard of such beings, but I've never run across any like this. I guess my life was pretty quiet in New Zebedee." "Ah, New Zebedee." Grandpa Drexel closed the book and gave Mrs. Zimmerman a long, sorrowful look. "You have not told me the whole truth, Lord Zimmerman. You say you are from a place called New Zebedee. You say it is far to the west, but I know some geography, and I do not think such a place as New Zebedee exists." Mrs. Zimmerman squirmed a bit. How could she tell this nice old man that the ghost in the mirror had been his own step-granddaughter, grown old and sour? Well, perhaps she could keep just a little back. She said, "I'm not quite sure how to explain this. Rosrita and I do come from New Zebedee, and it is a real town, but it was not settled until 1835. Mr. Drexel frowned. "Then it does not yet exist. Are you telling me, Mrs. Zimmerman, that you somehow from the future have come?" "Yes," Mrs. Zimmerman admitted, "from quite a long way in the future." "Ah," said Mr. Drexel, and he looked thoughtful. "I will ask no more. It is dangerous for a wizard to know much about the future." Mrs. Zimmerman was surprised that the old man accepted her story so readily, but then he was a wizard, and wizards have a way of taking in stride fantastic ideas that might knock a mail carrier or a lawyer for a loop. After a long time, Grandpa Drexel said, "This is what I think. I think you brought a mirror that had been enchanted by an evil sorcerer, a real hexer. Perhaps he himself has long been dead in your time. But I think he is alive in this time, our time, and I believe that his power over the mirror is so great because this is also his time." The old man held up a long bony finger. "However, Albertus has more to say about Erdspiegels that are created by means of Azael's infernal powers. Azael sometimes helps his followers find riches, but he is a very dangerous spirit who often demands human sacrifice in payment for his aid. And like all evil spirits, Azael is tricky, spiteful, and vicious. There may be a chance, just a chance, you understand, that the evil spirit would reveal the master of the mirror to us. In doing so, he would be performing an act of great treachery, but that is exactly what demons do." "Yes," Mrs. Zimmerman said sadly, "I see the chance that you mean, only neither of us is strong enough to try to use my mirror. Why, if the wizard who controls it became aware of us, he might take away our memory for good, or make both of us drooling idiots. Grandpa Drexel nodded warily. You are right. If I had my full health, I would chance it. But the least exertion exhausts me. However, there is my granddaughter Hilda. You may have noticed that she has powers like your own. Oh, they are not developed yet, but she will be a great bruja in her time. You may be able to call upon her strength to aid us. Mrs. Zimmerman shook her head. No, I can't allow Hilda to run such a terrible risk. We'll have to think of something else. After taking a deep breath, Grandpa Drexel said, I must admit I am relieved. Little Hilda is dear to me as a grandchild by blood would be. Well, I have written the necessary charm, translating from Albertus Magnus. There it is, that piece of paper folded in the book. Let me try to recover my strength, and perhaps before the moon is full we may be able to make an attempt. Or else we must of something else think, as you say. Mrs. Zimmerman gathered up the tray with Grandpa Drexel's supper dishes in it. Neither of them noticed a soft squeak as someone moved in the hall. It was Heinrich, and he had been sitting on the floor just outside his grandfather's door. He had heard everything that Mrs. Zimmerman and Grandpa Drexel had said, and now he couldn't wait to find Rosarita and share it with her. And that's the end of chapter 9.